up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
Did Moses predict 400 years of black enslavement? From Deuteronomy chapter 28, when we read those passages, some of them that were listed there were about 10 pieces or 10 verses that are generally used to advance the idea that blacks are Hebrews, are Israelites, and that the picture of Deuteronomy 28 is one that is describing America. There were 10 specific phrases that we identify. One was that it said that no man would save thee, talking about them when they went into captivity. The beginning of it in Deuteronomy 28, it speaks of the blessings and the curses. The first blessings, they fell through about verse 13. And then the curses also would follow from 14 all the way to verse 68, the ending of the chapter. In those things, it said that no man would save thee, that others would ravish or rape their wives, that they would build houses and and that they would not be able to live in them, that their sons and daughters would go into captivity, that they would plant, others would eat the fruit of their planting, that they would wear yokes of iron or chains. They would be in hunger and thirst, and they would need all things, and a nation that is far away would come and take them. The last two would be that that nation would be as swift as an eagle, and that they would be taken by ships and made slaves. If we look at those 10 pieces as listed as such, some identify and they map those up to sequences of history that took place in America, and they are clear to state that, look, these 10 things or these things were listed, and here's the fulfillment of it that we're able to see, so that when we check them off, that one after another, that these things happen. Number one, no man would save thee. It's a comparative to the Fugitive Slave Act that made it illegal for slaves to find refuge in the homes or lands of anyone. That if you had a slave, that you were obligated, duty bound, to deliver the slave back over to the slave master. Number two, that others would ravish or rape their wives. We talk of the brutality that was seen in slavery, where women were raped. Number three, they would build houses and others would live in them. That they would build and labor, but their work would not be something that they would reap and enjoy. Others would have it. They would not have homes or their own property that they would merely build, others would occupy. Number four, that their sons and daughters would be born into captivity, given away. And we have certainly identified that that took place during American slavery, that children were stolen, they were sold, given away, families broken apart, separated, husbands sold off, wives sold off, children sold or given away. Number five, that they would plant, others would eat. We again identified the work of the field workers. Number six, that they would wear yokes of iron, that they would have iron chains. And some of them, if you Google the phrase yokes of iron, it is not uncommon to see pictures of men that would have chains on them. Number seven, that they would be hungry and thirst and in need of all things. We certainly can identify that with a horrible living conditions that blacks faced and even face. Number eight, a nation far off would take them away, or a nation that was many miles away. And they find the fulfillment of that with America being a land across the waters. Number nine, it would be as swift as an eagle, in, of course, a comparison to America's national symbol or emblem, the bald eagle. Then lastly, they would be taken by ships and made slaves, and that this then therein is referring to the transatlantic slave trade. for the yokes of iron. We see similar pictures. We think of the bald eagle in America. And some suggest then that this would be America. And again, when we looked at those things as they were listed there were only 10 items that are listed. So if we selectively chose Deuteronomy 28 and we cherry picked those verses, then we could look and say, well, that could symbolize America. As a matter of fact, not only could it symbolize America, but it could symbolize any nation that took place in the slave trade. It could also symbolize Europe. It could symbolize Spain, symbolize France, Portugal, whatever. Now, then some would argue and push back, well, no, there's the eagle that is there. So then if you talk about the eagle as a symbol that people would use, and they'll say, well, that's only one nation, and that nation alone is America. As we discussed and as we found that there are other aspects of Deuteronomy 28. It is not one piece of prophecy. And so when Scripture is given, we can't pick the pieces that paint the narrative. It's like taking data. You can't pick the pieces that support the view that you want to espouse. If you are suggesting that there is a miracle drug or that there's a miracle herb and that people take it, that they're cured of whatever the ailment is, and you look at the research that is around it and you have, say, 100 people that were tested and you found 10 people that had really good results from it, or 5 people that had really good results from it, and 95 people had horrible results. Is it right to take the results of the 5 people and to publicize that and to say that this is the result, these are the overwhelming results that everyone will have? Absolutely not, because the 95 had adverse effects. The 5 had, quote, the effect that you so desired. It would be just the same, it would be incongruous for us to take the same from Deuteronomy 28, to pick the verses that tell the story that we want to paint, and not select look at all the verses in the story that the entire chapter paints. So quickly in verse 36, we saw that it said that the Lord shall bring thee and thy king, which thou shalt set over thee, into a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, and there shalt thou serve other gods, wood and stone. So one of the things that also is included in Deuteronomy chapter 28 is that not only would the people go into captivity, but who else would go? Their king. Their king would also go into captivity. And once more, then I push back from the notion that America is identified. For this to be true then we would need to find records of kings being transported and brought to America and made slaves. Will we not? I mean, that's what it says, that your king also is going to go with you. So in order for that to be America, then we would need to find instances of kings being transported and brought to America. If we don't, then it doesn't work. In the words of Johnny Cochran, he said, if the glove doesn't fit, then you must have quit. Borrowing that, if there are no kings, then we can't use the narrative. Now in Jeremiah chapter 9, in verse 15 and verse 16, it says that, therefore thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will feed them, even this people, with wormwood, and will give them water of gall to drink. I will scatter them also among the heathen, whom neither they nor their fathers have known, and I will send a sword after them till I have consumed them. So they would be sent to nations that they were not aware of, that they did not know. Now, as a historical fact, that when you talk about the slave trade, the nations that came into Africa and participated in the slave trade, these were nations, particularly when we talk about the language, English as a language, was a nation a language that had been there, that was not foreign to those who, quote, heard it. And today, if you travel to various parts of Africa, then you know that there are some people who speak French. There are some people who speak Spanish. And there are a plethora of people who speak English, of course, today. If you go back hundreds of years, you'll find the same thing. Why? Because many colonies or many places were colonized by these European powers. Jeremiah 16 verse 13, therefore will I cast you out of this land into a land that you know not, neither ye nor your fathers. So they would be cast into a land that they didn't know. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 28 identified various characteristics. It said that they would be there and that no man would redeem them. Further in Deuteronomy chapter 28, which again doesn't hold true to American slavery. Further in Deuteronomy chapter 28, there are other aspects that are listed there. And so we have these pieces of a puzzle that we're trying to force to fit to make into America. One of the startling pieces there is that it builds off of a case of what we also read of the captivity that people tie in from Genesis chapter 15. But we have these pieces of the puzzle that people are trying to put in, and as you can see, the pieces don't fit. We can't simply make it work. It is like trying to force a square peg into a round hole. It doesn't fit. It doesn't work. And because it doesn't fit, it doesn't work, then it's almost like this is where we are. We're going to force it to fit in. We're going to make it fit because Deuteronomy 28, it sounds more compelling when you talk about this through the lens of blacks, through the lens of people of color. But it doesn't fit, so we can simply try to force it to make it work, or we must then determine then that that is not a place or piece that goes. In Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 4 and 5, we read of kings going into captivity. The Zedekiah, king of Judah, shall not escape out of the hand of the Chaldeans, but shall surely be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon, and shall speak with him mouth to mouth, and his eyes shall behold his eyes. And he shall lead Zedekiah to Babylon, and there shall he be until I visit him, saith the Lord. Though ye fight with the Chaldeans, ye shall not prosper. According to Ezekiel chapter 12 and verse 13, we've read as well, that my net shall I also spread upon him, and he shall be taken in my snare, and I will bring him to Babylon, to the land of the Chaldeans. Yet shall he not see it, though he shall die there. Regarding the yoke of iron, we found that, again, this is not talking about a literal yoke that was placed upon the necks of people, but rather it was symbolic, it was symbolism. And the symbolism we saw was in Jeremiah chapter 28, as Jeremiah described that yokes of iron would be replaced because they had broken the yokes of wood. And when they went into captivity, there were never people walking through with yokes that were placed upon them. This was symbolic in terms of something being placed upon their necks in Palestine, but rather this was saying that you're going to be led away captive. And that these yokes of iron you're going to be led where you don't want to go. And Lamentations 1:14, the yoke of my transgressions is bound by his hand. They are wreathed and come up upon my neck. He hath made my strength to fall. The Lord hath delivered me into their hands, from whom I am not able to rise up. Then quickly in Isaiah 10, we read about the nations from afar. We saw nations of Assyria, Babylon, and in Egypt. We see Rome, other powers that would come and would carry them into captivity. So again, Deuteronomy chapter 28 is not describing then slavery. Well, how can we be sure? The last verses that we'll look at in verse 68, Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 68. The Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. By the way, the Israelites, as they heard these words, would have been petrified by it. Why? Because they had just left slavery. Moses is speaking to them, and he's telling them that we're about to go into the promised land, and this is upon the borders of the entry into the promised land. Moses was not privileged to lead them into the land. Joshua would do so, but before the transition of power, he divides them 6 tribes on Mount Ebal, 6 tribes upon Mount Gerizim, And he proclaims again these words, the law of God, showing that as they go into the land of Canaan, the condition of their success is incumbent upon them being obedient to the law of God. Blessing if they will obey, curses if they will disobey. And so he says that you're going to go back again into Egypt if this be a case. So as they hear this, they are terrified by the reality that if we mess up, if we forget about God, then the die is cast, we're going to go back into Egypt again. Now this is in contrast to what Moses had previously said in Exodus, because he said in Exodus that the Egyptians that are coming after you, you will see them again no more. That was in Exodus chapter 14. And now he is not saying something different. He is simply saying that, look, if you obey God, you will never have to worry again about captivity. But if you disobey, then you will be captive. And so I've referenced these verses to illustrate that Israel was carried away on ship, by ship. Verse 68, it says that the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. By the way whereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again, and there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no one shall buy you. According to Ezekiel chapter 27 and verse 13, it says that Javan, Tubal, and Meshach, they were thy merchants, they traded the persons of men and vessels of brass in thy market. Joel 3:6, the children also of Judah and the children of Jerusalem have ye sold unto the Grecians, or to the Greeks, that ye might remove them far from their border. They were sold to Greeks to be removed far from their borders. Amos 1:9. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Tyre, and for 4 I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they delivered up the whole captivity to Edom, and remembered not the brotherly covenant. Josephus writes again of the experience of certain Jews being sold into bondage. And you would read that, of course, in the works of Flavius Josephus. The word return, or I will bring thee back again refers back to that they're going to come to a place that they had been previously, and they're going to come back again. Now, if we build off of the supposition in Deuteronomy 28 that it's referring to America, that America is Egypt, then the logical question we would have to ask then is, well, when was the first time that blacks came here? Because what Moses is talking about is that there's a time period that will intervene. That you were there, and I'm bringing you back again full circle. So if this is true then, and we must follow the logic, if the logic holds true, then we must ask then, well, when were blacks first brought to America? Now, we know the answer to that historically was in the year 1619. That was the year that blacks were brought to America in Jamestown, Virginia. So, but if this is true then, they would have to have been here prior to 1619, correct? I mean, if you're coming back again, if 1619 is the punishment, then they would have had to have been here prior. So whether we were to pick 1617, 1618, 1600, whatever year someone would try to suggest, they would have had to have been there before in order to be able to come back again. But history doesn't testify to that. So the fallacy that has been built up that Deuteronomy 28 is referring to the enslavement of blacks, when we examine it upon the weight of its own merits, the story doesn't bear weight on its own. So someone might say, well, what about the fact that blacks have suffered in America? Yes, absolutely, that is true. What about the reality that blacks were brought by ship to America? Yes, that is true. What about the fact that our women have been ravished? Yes, that is true. What about the fact that we've been sold into bondage? Yes, that is true. But again, that's not what Deuteronomy 28 is talking about at all. There are similarities, but similarities don't make something the same thing. There are many similarities between one sickness and another sickness. And if you are like a hypochondriac, you hear of certain symptoms and illnesses and think that, oh man, I must have that. You read about it and said that one of the signs that you'll have a fever, and you say, well, I have a fever. And then you look at the other sign and says, well, person will also have this manifestation. And you also say, well, okay, I'm also having this symptom as well. And you read something else, like I also had that as well. And you read that and you think, okay, well, man, I only have a few days left to live because these are the telltale signs of this sickness. But you have missed out on the other 7 different items that are listed there that would disqualify you from having said sickness. In like manner, when we consider Deuteronomy chapter 28, we cannot selectively choose various verses and then just gloss over the other ones. The main verse that is used is verse 68 that says that we'll go back again into this land, that we'll return back to Egypt again. My question then is, was America or any other nation ever called Egypt? And the answer is no. It was never referred to as Egypt. In fact, going a step further, what Moses is describing in Deuteronomy 28 is that literal slavery or symbolic slavery. And he talks about them being bound, of them suffering, of a nation rising up. Is this all symbolism or is this what reality is? This is what reality would be. And so if we follow that notion then we would expect a literal fulfillment of Deuteronomy 28, not a spiritual fulfillment. Bishop Newton wrote in his book, Dissertations on the Prophecies, which have remarkably been fulfilled and at this time are fulfilling in the world, volume 1, page 130 and 131, wrote the following. They, referring to the Hebrews, had come out of Egypt triumphant, but now they should return thither as slaves. They had walked through the sea as dry land at their coming out, but now they should be carried thither in ships. They might be carried thither in the ships of the Tyrrhenian or Sidonian merchants or by the Romans who had a fleet in the Mediterranean. And this was a much safer way of conveying so many prisoners than sending them by land. Josephus again states the same thing regarding their captivity. Let's turn our attention to Genesis chapter 15, verse 13 and verse 14, because again, with Deuteronomy chapter 28, that some suggest that there 400 years was prophesied by Moses of the blacks' enslavement. And these things take a lot of attention and they gain a lot of notoriety because when you hear of what could be you tend to get excited. We as a people have been oppressed. We as a people have faced undue and unimaginable hardships and plight in this country. And it resonates with us, these stories. It is ironic, and it should be noted that with blacks who were in slavery, the story of the Hebrew enslavement resonated with them. Now, if blacks and Hebrews are one and the same, the story should have done more than resonate. They should have said, that's our history. No, when they sung about Moses, and we know that Harriet Tubman became like a Moses to come and to let Israel go free. If the story was actually our story, then it would not be a similarity, but it would be simply a recurrence of the same event. And we don't find any records of those enslaved making this connection, but with their past. In fact, we find in slavery no records whatsoever of anyone identifying with Israelites. We don't find them keeping Sabbath. We don't find them practicing circumcision. We don't find them practicing any of the ceremonial laws. We don't find them practicing and abstaining from clean meats versus unclean meats in Deuteronomy 14, Leviticus chapter 11, and so forth. We don't find them worshiping in the same capacity that we read about the followers of Jehovah. And one must ask themselves, why not, if this is such an indelible mark in their history? Well, Genesis chapter 15 is a story that God uses an experience of talking to Abram. Abram is going to become the father of the faithful, the father of the Jewish nation. In verse 13, we read that he said to Abram, meaning God, know of a surety, or be certain that your seed shall be a what? A stranger in a land that is not whose? Theirs, and they shall do what there? They shall serve them. And they, meaning the people, shall do what to them? They shall afflict them for how long? For 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve, God is going to do what to them? I will judge them, and afterwards they shall come out, meaning your descendants, your seed, is going to come out with what? With great substance. And thou, Abram, shall go to thy fathers in peace, and thou shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation, in which generation now? The fourth, they shall come hither again, meaning your descendants are going to come back here again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. There's a lot that is to unpack and worthy of consideration in that verse, okay? Because this verse, it prophesies or predicts how many years of sojourning and affliction? 400. They're going to be for 400 years. So God is telling Abraham, listen, Abraham, you're in the land of Canaan, and that's where Abram was. He was in the land of Canaan. And Abram is looking all around, and to him he's been here, but he does not see any movement. He doesn't see how God is going to fulfill the word that he has spoken. And so God reminds him, Abram, that don't look at what you can see, but look at the land. All this I am going to give your descendants. But your seed is going to serve in a land that is not theirs. So obviously this is not referring to the promised land, okay? Because Abram is in receiving the vision in the land of Canaan. Canaan is now occupied, according to verse 14, by what group of people, at least? The Amorites. Now we know that there are Amorites, the Hittites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, and so forth. The list goes on that were there. But he says that the land that you're in, it is not yours now, but it will be yours in the future or after 400 years. But between now and then, your seed is going to go into a strange land, and they're going to serve there for 400 years. They're going to be afflicted there for 400 years. They're going to be in this bondage for 400 years, this servitude, this wandering. But I'm going to judge that nation that they're going to go to. So we're talking about two different nations, are we not? We're talking about one, the land of Canaan, and two, this other strange land is what we're talking about. And they're going to serve in this strange land, and after their period of servitude is over, they're going to come back to this land, the land of Canaan, and they're going to come back not as paupers, but they're going to come back with what? Great substance. But you're going to be dead and gone. You're going to go to sleep in peace, but at an old age. And your descendants are going to come back and stay in this land. So it's pretty straightforward of what would take place. 400 years is what he promised unto them. So quickly, 6 things. 1, that they would be in a land that is not theirs. That's where there they would serve as servants. Okay, so if they're going to serve as servants in a land that is not theirs, whatever land that is not Hebrew land. Does that make sense? Number 2, in that land, they're going to work as servants. Number 3, that God is going to bring judgment upon that nation. 4, they're going to be released and come out of that land, that territory with great substance, and then they will return to the land of the Amorites or to the promised land. 400 years they will be in this sojourning for. In Genesis chapter 21, well, how does this 400 years, where do we find it? In Genesis chapter 21, Look in verse 5, Genesis chapter 21, and first in verse 5, and then we'll read in verse 9. In Genesis chapter 21, we'll read in verse 5, and incidentally, when Abram received the covenant with God, how old was Abram? How old was Abram when he received the covenant that God made with him? Abram was 75 years of age, and God gave the covenant to him. Now, in Genesis chapter 21 and verse 5, we read that Abraham was how old? 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. So Abram was 75 when the covenant was given. And now when his son Isaac is born to him, he's how old? 100 years of age. Simple mathematics. If we took away 75 years or 75 from 100, how many years have elapsed between the time Abram was called and to the time that Isaac was born? 25 years. Okay, 25 years have elapsed. Now in the same chapter, Genesis chapter 21 and verse 9. Genesis chapter 21 and actually you can read verse 8 and verse 9. It says, and so the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. Now incidentally, in those days, that women weaned their children when they were about 2 to 3 years of age. Now, you think of that to our customs and so forth today. Most children are off of breast milk way quicker than 2 to 3 years. And this is not saying this is good, this is bad. That's not the point. The point is just simply saying what their custom was, what their habits were. So about 2 to 3 years of age, you'd have children still on the breast. Now, if you saw that today, you'd say, what's wrong with that baby? You might say, what's wrong with that mama? But this is something that they did in 2 Chronicles chapter 21. It establishes the same fact that they were about 2 to 3 years of age when they were on the breast. And it is at this time period now that in Genesis chapter 21, that in verse 9, what happened on this faithful gathering on this occasion? It says, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian. And by the way, for those that are so caught up in color in the Bible, you know the Bible doesn't go into color? It doesn't go into what color this person was, what color that person was. It only introduces nationalities or nations to tell stories. Like you read about Uriah the Hittite. And now we read about Hagar the Egyptian. Read about some of the Cushites and so forth. The Queen of Sheba. It generally just makes general stories and it tells of people's interactions and so forth. And if it makes the purpose of being able to accentuate the story, then it highlights the nation of origin, but never color. You know, why is that? Jesus told the story about the Samaritan. Wasn't concerned about color. He told the story to be able to help to illustrate the moral of what he was saying. Incidentally, the Bible is not a book of white people because some people think, well, the Bible is just white people. You know, well, obviously, they don't know history, and you don't know history if that's what you think because the Bible is not about white people. And there's some people say, well, the Bible is all about black people, and obviously you don't know history either because, no, the Bible is not all about black people. The color of people's skin is never introduced in Scripture. We use those things to separate and to isolate and to sometimes to try to unify, but the reality is it is not about the color of a person's skin. You know what it's really about? It's about the condition of a person's heart. It's about the color of the blood that was shed that makes us one. So in terms of color, the one that I would say is most important is red. The blood that was shed. But people make an emphasis on it, and we find it introduces the title only to be able to bring home a storyline, to bring home a point. It's like if you went to the store, you don't have to tell the story that, I went to the store and the cashier was super friendly and very helpful and so forth. You don't need to tell that. You don't need to identify race or color to tell the story. But if you were perhaps in a group that people thought that all white people were devils, and that every white person was out to get someone and to do them evil and to do them bad, and you went to the store and you came out and it was a Caucasian person that had helped you, you might tell the story that, hey, I went to the store and it was a Caucasian white person that helped me. Or, well, obviously they're Caucasian, they're white. A Caucasian person that helped me. Or if they say, well, all Russians are this, or all blacks are this, you might relate the story and interject the nationality to be able to drive home the point. That no, that the conception and the idea that you have is without merit, is without basis. And as I said before, I will say again that every race, every nationality has great things to be proud of. Blacks have a ton of things to be proud of. Whites have a ton of things to be proud of. Of course, black and white are not the only colors, but blacks have a lot of things to be ashamed of. And whites also have a lot of things to be ashamed of. Skin color is not what saves. Ultimately, it is the blood of Jesus. And you know, the Bible doesn't even talk about Jesus' skin color. Now, I know somebody's saying, well, what about Revelation chapter 1? We'll talk about Revelation chapter 1 down the road, but it doesn't make an emphasis upon Jesus' skin color. You know why? Because it wasn't important. Isaiah says that when we see him, there's no form, no comeliness that we would desire him. His outer visage was not something that would draw men. He did not come showing that he was, 6'5" or 6'6". And that it was a lot of outer beauty that was about, it was nothing about his outside, it was all about the inside of his character that would attract and to draw men to him. But we get caught up into color and so forth. And yes, I understand and know that people have used the scriptures to interject race to try to make it fit their narrative. But God didn't do that, though. And God does not do that. So just because people have tried to hijack the beauty of Scripture, it certainly doesn't make it right, nor does it carry the message of what God is seeking to convey, because all throughout the Bible we see the common denominator that God was seeking to draw all men unto himself. So, and if I be lifted up, I will draw not Jews, not, quote, Gentiles, not the Amorites or this nation. It was talking about, I will draw all men unto myself. Isaac was weaned, and during this time, what Genesis 21 is denoting is that Ishmael mocked Isaac, and that mocking is simply referring to persecution, a form of persecution. It was denoting the persecution that they would experience for 400 years. Of course, in a more broader perspective, well, how do we know? Notice in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 29. Galatians chapter 4 and verse 29. It says, but as at that time, he who was born according to the flesh, talking about Abram's descendants, Isaac and Ishmael. And when we read in the scriptures, Ishmael was born according to the flesh. Isaac was born the child of promise. And so we read that, but as that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to what? The Spirit. So what is Paul saying? He's saying that, listen, the one that was born according to the flesh persecuted the one that was born according to the Spirit. What is that referring us back to? Genesis chapter 21. Ishmael and Isaac. Because it was after this instance that Sarah said to Abraham that Hagar must leave. So this is the beginning of that affliction that we can certainly identify. Secondly, we also look at Jacob fleeing from Esau. Now obviously they were brothers, full-bred brothers, but it's the righteous being persecuted by the wicked is what the storyline is telling. Genesis 27, 41 through 43, and Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father had blessed him. And of course what Jacob did was wrong. Okay, his stealing was wrong. But Esau said in his heart that the days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then I will slay my brother Jacob. Genesis 37, 28 as well as in Genesis 39 and verse 20. Joseph was sold by his own brothers as a slave and later thrown into jail. Then there passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. And then lastly, we know that from Joseph's experience that later on his father came down to visit him. And there Israel was to stay for the next 200 years. There were not immediately slaves there, but afterwards, according to Exodus chapter 1, that there rose up a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. History lets us know that there were ruling classes, various nations that had come in. During the time that Joseph was ruling in Egypt, Egypt was governed by the Hyksos. And this was an Asiatic clan that had come from Canaan, and they were ruling in Egypt. But somewhere after Joseph's death, the Egyptians overthrew the Hyksos. And the Hyksos were forced out of the country. And the Egyptians took over, and as they took over now, they're showing indifference toward those who had been showed favoritism under the rulership of the Hyksos. You can look at a contemporary story with with Rwanda. And you find that one nation or one group is favored against another group. And when the ruling power leaves, that things can quickly go chaotic and turn to tragedy. So when this Pharaoh says that he does not know Joseph, certainly he would be familiar with the work of Joseph from the annals of history. But he is not identifying anything with Joseph, nor Joseph's God in the history of the deliverance that was there, because again, the Egyptians were by and large polytheistic, though there are some periods that we can see monotheism ruling, but by and large polytheistic. And so his response is that he will not let them go, but verse 12 says, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. Now remember in Genesis chapter 15 we read that they were going to serve for how many years? For 400 years that they were going to be there. And we saw the things that were to take place during that period of sojourning. Now again, that period, it didn't start in Egypt. The 400 years covers their sojourning and their whole experience. In Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40. Now, this is how accurate it is. And so again, those that will push out that Deuteronomy 28 is about blacks and that Genesis chapter 15 is about blacks, well, again, we need to find the history. We must find then the biblical references as well, the scriptural references to establish. This is what Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 and verse 41 state. It says, now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was how long? 430 years. Now hold it, we have a problem here, slight problem here then, because we read earlier that how long would they serve for? 400 years, and now Moses says that they were there for how long? For 430 years. Further, it says that, and it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the self same day, it came to pass. That is amazing when you look at it. You know, God did not lose track of it. You're making cakes, and you have the oven timed, and you get caught up doing something else, and you've set the timer, and all of a sudden, oh no, I forgot about the cake, and you run back and the cake is ruined, burnt, because you forgot the timer. And the alarm is going off on the microwave or the stove, the lights are flashing and so forth. You're like, man, I forgot it. I got so caught up in doing something else, I completely forgot about it. God didn't forget about his people. They were in captivity and in bondage, and he doesn't allow the time to go beyond and say, oh, I forgot all about, oh man, I forgot all about Israel. They're in bondage and captivity. I need to do something. As a side note, it is something as well to consider that what Genesis says is the 400 years of sojourning that they were going to be there. And now in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40, it says that it was fulfilled on that same day, 430 years later. Well, how could that be? Because we have this little dilemma here, this extra 30 years. In Galatians chapter 3 and verse 17, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 17. It says, and after this, in this I say that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law which was 430 years after, cannot disannul that it should make the promise of none effect. So in other words, the law from the time of the giving of the law, again, to this experience that we see, this time period, this whole thing from the proclamation, the covenant, all the way down to the end is 430 years. Okay? So again, keep in mind it's 430 years. So what it is saying is not that God forgot about it, but it's adding in a time frame to talk about from the covenant all the way down to the end. So that 430 years begins all the way from the beginning of the covenant all the way down to the departure of Israel or the giving of the law upon Mount Sinai. God did not lengthen out the 400 years that we read about in Genesis chapter 15. When that was fulfilled, it was all over. So to illustrate of which, if you follow on the first line, the covenant was made with Abraham when he was 75 years of age. We've already identified that 25 years later that Isaac was born. When Isaac was 60, Jacob was born. When we read in Genesis, Jacob went to Egypt when he was 130 years of age. So when we add that time period up, then we know that we're at 215 years before they go into Egypt. Paul said it was 430 years that they were sojourning for. So if there are 430 years that they are sojourning, the totality, okay? And 215 years we've already consumed by the birth of Joseph, the birth of Isaac, and the covenant with Abraham, then that's 215 years that Israel was in Palestine for. Does that make sense? And if they were there for 215 years, and the sojourning was for a total of 430 years, then we simply must take away the 215 years that they were in Palestine from the total of 430 years to get the remaining years that they must have been in Egypt. Does that make sense? So in doing so then, we know that they would have spent how long in Egypt? 215 years. So the second line again illustrates the fact that 215 years they will be in Palestine, and 215 years that they were in Egypt. The third line illustrates that it was 25 years between the birth of the covenant was given, and then we have the birth of Isaac, and then 400 years thereafter of them sojourning. Or in Exodus 21, or rather Exodus 12, verse 40, and in Galatians chapter 3, we have again the totality of the 430 years. So when we talk about the 400 years and the 430 years, it's simply encompassing the time of their sojourning plus their persecution. And according to Exodus chapter 12, on this exact day, God brought them out. Now, was it all fulfilled as he said? Turn back to Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13. Did it happen then as he said? So according to Genesis, I submit to you that the fulfillment of Genesis chapter 15, the 400 years, is referencing the Israelite plight that they experienced in Palestine and in Canaan. Well, does that line with what we read? Let's read back at Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. And so he said to Abram, that know of a certainty that your descendants or your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs and will serve them. And they will afflict them 400 years. Again, I stress that they will not be in Egypt for 400 years. You will not find records of them being in Egypt for 400 years. The historical record does not attest to that, nor does the biblical record attest to that. We do find, however, affliction for 400 years. We do find it for the period of 430. 14 says, in the nation that they serve, I will judge, and afterward they shall come out with great substance. Okay? So if we're following through as Genesis is telling us, after the captivity is over, after they have served in this strange land, which then we can substitute because we've identified that they were serving in what land? Egypt. That afterwards they will come out with great what? With great substance. They would leave forth with great substance. So, did Israel leave out with great substance? In Exodus chapter 12 and verse 35, did they leave out with great substance? Now, if they left out broke, would that prophecy have been fulfilled? No. If they left out on the exact day, but their pockets were empty, just lint in it, would that have fulfilled the prophecy? No, it would not have. All right, that's the thing about prophecy. You can't, if it says like 5 pieces, you can't find 4 and just say, well, let's just ignore the other one because that's not important. This is not making a cake. It's not making pancakes where you can like substitute one thing for another. It's very specific. You can't say, well, I'll replace this for that because I don't have this. Or I'm just going to skip out this ingredient because it's really not that important to make the recipe work. You can do that in some things in life, but we can't do that when it comes to the Word. You can't add to it, we can't take away from it. So if these things are necessary, then we must find them to be fulfilled. So now in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 34. In Exodus chapter 12 and verse 34, do they leave out with great substance, or do they leave out with merchandise? So we read in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 34. And the people took their dough before it was leavened in their kneading troughs, being bound up in their clothes upon their shoulders. And the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses. And they borrowed of the Egyptians. That word borrow doesn't mean as we think of it. Hey, can you let me have something and I'll pay you back? That's not what that word means in the Hebrew. It means they requested it of them. Okay? They requested of the Egyptians what things? Jewels of silver and jewels of what? Of gold and what else? And raiment. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they lent unto them such things as they required. And it says they did what to the Egyptians? They spoiled the Egyptians. So what did they receive for their payment while they were there as slaves? They received silver, gold, raiment, precious jewels. Now, nowhere does Exodus say that this might fulfill the word that was spoken in Genesis chapter 15. Nor does Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 through 41 state that this might fulfill what was spoken in Genesis chapter 15. But it fulfills it. How do we know? Because they were served, and now they're going to come out of this land, and they're coming out with great what? Substance. They had no substance prior. Not as a people. You know, they had various things, but no great substance. But now they go to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians say, we want you to leave, and we'll give whatever is necessary. Just go. Get out of our coast, lest our nation be destroyed. Here is silver, here are gold, here are raiment. Go and be no more, lest a worse thing come upon us. So they fulfilled then the word. Another translation says that they plundered the Egyptians. They stripped the Egyptians of their wealth. So here they come out of Egypt, loaded down with the blessings of God spiritually, but with the blessings also literally. I emphasize that Deuteronomy 28 was spoken of literally. Because there are people today that will try to say, well, Deuteronomy 28, yeah, it's talking about the slave ships are real, but the other things are all figurative. That's not what it says. So let's do the math then. Let's do the math, because I've shown you the math of the 430 years of the Bible. Now, to the other side, if we say that 1619, that the first African slave was brought to America, then we need to simply add 400 years to get to the ending of that. Am I correct? Am I wrong? We'd add those 400 years, and if we add 400 years to 1619, then that brings us to what year? 2019. I'll be interested to find a person that can show me that captivity ended in 2019. Okay, we've looked at the biblical perspective. Moses wasn't talking about blacks in slavery. But if we're going to use that to say that he is talking about blacks in captivity, then in 2019, that would mean that captivity ended. And if that is true, that 2019 marked the ending of that captivity, then we also need to ask ourselves what important question from what we've read. Because did slavery end in 2019? Well, we have some problems with that theology. Okay, so where is the great substance? Because he said that your nation that you're going to go there, and you're going to leave out of that nation with great substance. So where's the great substance that blacks have as a group of people? I'm not talking about this one person here, person there, as a nation. According to what we read in Exodus, the Israelites went to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians gave them all these things. So if we're to follow the narrative that is suggested, then I would ask, then where is the great substance? And we would have received this in 2019, according to the ending of 400 years. Now, I don't know about you, but I looked at my bank account, and I don't see the great substance that people are talking about. I don't know about you, but I look at my home, and I don't see the great substance that people are talking about. Now, I'm not saying that we have not been blessed, but I'm saying where is this great substance that is herein spoken of? And I don't know about you, but if this is true, then that text says that we need to go back to what land? To the promised land. Now, that's not talking about going back to Africa. Because Abraham was told that in what land? In the land of Canaan. And Canaan, scripturally, has never been identified with the land of Africa. So don't tell me that, we need to go back to Africa, because that's not what the text says. In fact, the text suggests that Africa would be a strange country to us. So we need to go back to the land of Canaan, or to the land of the Amorites. So we have a couple of problems here because, we're 4 years after the fact in 2023, and we don't have any great substance. And some people say, well, that's what reparations and the government's going to give us money. Well, don't hold your breath. Now, don't get me wrong. If there are reparations and the government will pay, which they should pay, if they're going to pay, hey, I'll be the first one in line, okay? I'll be the first one in line. But by the same token, don't hold your breath on that. It's like you going out and you buying a car and a house and getting an apartment and taking a trip. And you're like, well, how am I going to pay for this? And you say, well, government's going to pay me. Okay, well, that don't hold your breath on that. Okay? Where is the great substance? When are we going to go back to the promised land? And also, according to this, God said he was going to judge the nation that they were in, and it would be destroyed. Now, please don't insult your intelligence by pointing to one or two isolated events to say that this is a fulfillment of that. Okay, because again, if we're going to follow true to the script, it has to be 2019. So don't come and say, well, 2007, a lot of the wealth in America was taken away. Well, that's 12 years too soon, is it not? And that's like saying that Jesus was predicted that he would be born in this year, but he was born like 5 years early. And you say, well, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. If it's 5 years early, it's too soon. If it's 5 years too late, it's too late. So where is the destruction of America? And according to the promise in the text, that God would bring them out with a strong hand. Lastly, in closing, there's again a lot more to look at. We have not talked about it, but I want to reference these texts. Ezra chapter 2. In antiquity, when the Israelites went back home, keeping up with their genealogy was something that was important then. You remember the story when they went back in Ezra, that there were certain men who claimed that they were priests, but they were unable to establish any genealogical records. They couldn't produce and to show, hey, we are who we say we are. Anybody can jump up and say that, hey, I'm a part of your family. And you have it happen because when you get some money, like a windfall of cash, people who you don't know are cousins, say, hey, I'm your cousin from your mama's side. And I know we haven't met before, but I've been knowing you. They have the, quote, genealogy. And you're looking at them like, man, you don't look anything like. Well, in Ezra chapter 2, when they could not establish their genealogy, they were not allowed to enter the priesthood until a priest arose having Urim and Thummim. The implication being is that they were not received until their story could be verified. Now, I ask us then as blacks, as people of color that would promulgate and push this narrative that we are Israelites, we're Hebrew Israelites. Why is it there's no genealogy? And people say, oh, well, the white man destroyed all that. How would the white man destroy oral tradition being passed down from one person to the next? How would records be obliterated? Even when you talk of Aleksey's work and roots, it is the words and so forth that are brought back, Ko and Tubab, the Mandinka, all those different things. And not one Sabbath. He remembers and talks about his father and so forth, Amore, but not those things that are distinctive of the Hebrew economy and culture. We can make a claim and say that, yes, we are Israelites, but we have to have the ability to be able to demonstrate it and to back it up. One of the challenges I think that we face, and I'll talk more into this when we go into where did all this come from, it is the fact that one of the things psychologically that people of color have been through so much that we want to feel good about ourselves. And in the process of wanting to feel good about ourselves, and we are sometimes eager to latch on to anything that will help us to feel good about ourselves. And so if this could be true of blacks being, quote, Hebrews, of blacks being, quote, God's people, and that this knowledge has been hidden from an oppressor so that we would not know, and we can identify with this and to be able to see, then this helps to fill a void that is there. A void in which some writers, or one writer speaks of it as a somewhat subtle inferiority complex. That we're looking to be validated by the mainstream by having some type of consciousness of kind. But the reality is that we don't need to take someone's history to try to establish our own. There are plenty of things of historical significance, prominence that are authentically 100% black. I don't need to go and to steal someone's history and to put a label on it to try to make it my history. Lastly, for those that struggle with that, one may ask, well, why even talk about these things? Well, I think it's important to understand and know it because there are many people who are questioning, and they take it even a step further and question the authenticity of the Bible. They make it all that these are just made up anecdotes by power-seeking men to keep people of color in oppression and darkness. And that they have the true light to be able to share, and that all these things will be given. And again, I submit back to the previous thing, beloved, the Bible never emphasizes color. If Jesus were white, would you serve him? If he were black, would you serve him? If he were yellow, would you serve him? If he were red, would you serve him? It is not about the color of the skin. The criterion that the Bible gave is that he is the Lamb of God, that he is the King of Kings. Color becomes an afterthought. The most important thing is the unity of the Spirit. And so as we look through these things, we will come face to face with some of these realities. But again, truth loses nothing by investigation. We'll have to stand on its own merit, or we'll either fall upon its own merit. And what we can see here is that God had a special regard, not just for one race of people, but for all members of the human race, so much so that John 3:16 says that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Christ came not to divide, but he came to unify. He came to break down the middle wall of partition and to open before us a way that we all might become one and united again in him and in his cause. So, Father in heaven, we thank you again for the word that we've been able to look at. Thank you for the time we've been able to spend together. Thank you for the truth of your word, and I pray that you would help to dispel ignorance, misunderstanding, and things that people will try to use to bring division. But help us to build upon those things in your word that will cause unity, that cause fellowship with one in mind and in spirit and in likeness unto you. Again, I pray you would bless and keep us all again through the remaining portion and time we have of the Sabbath. Thank you again for all of your blessings. In Jesus' name, amen.